In this lecture, it's time to take a first look at the application that we're going to build in this section. We will also take a closer look at the starter files for this project, and we will also check out the flowchart for this application. So let's get started. And this is the application that we will build throughout this section and also the next one. So it's called Bankist, and this is here the demo version that is actually live on bankist.netlify.app. So I invite you to actually try out this application together with me as you watch this video, so to get a real good feeling for how it all works. Now this looks a little bit empty, and so you can just basically log in. So write JS, and then the pin is 1111. And so Bankist stands for Minimalist Banking. And so this is why we have this kind of banking, so an online bank interface. So we have all the movements here. We have the overall balance of the account up here. Then we have some summary data down here. And here on the right side, we have three options that we can do. So we can transfer money to someone else, we can request a loan from the bank, and we can close the account. So let's request a loan here. Let's say I need 1,000 euros. So I click here, and then after some time it is approved, and it appears here as a deposit. Okay, then I can also transfer money, and there is a user called GD, and let's say I want to transfer 5,000. So let's try that. And so now I have 5,000 less than I used to have. Finally, we can also sort these here. So now they are sorted, and now they are back to normal. And now let's go to that other account, JD, with the pin of 2222. And so let's check out if she has a deposit of 5,000. And indeed, here it is. We also see that this account here is in US dollars and with the American formatting, while the other one was in euros. And so that's something that we're going to take care of in the next section. But in this section, we will actually take care of displaying all of these movements, making these operations here possible, calculating the statistics, as well as the current balance. And so, yeah, I think it's going to be a lot of fun, and I'm really happy with this application. I think it looks amazing. It also looks like a real-world use case. And yeah, overall, this is a great project for training arrays, because we can do lots of the stuff that you see here on the screen using arrays. Great. So now that you have a feeling for how this application works, let's take a look at a flowchart that I designed or that I built for this application. So here is that flowchart for the Bankist application. And just like before in the pick game, I built this one based on the flow of actions that we just saw in that live version of the Bankist application. So starting there in the top left, as the user logs in, which is one of these yellow actions. So all of these yellow elements here mean some sort of action. So when the login action is performed, we check for the correct credentials, and if they are correct, we display the UI, and then we also update the UI. And so that means to calculate the balance, calculate the summary, display the movements, and then later on in the next section, we will also start and display a logout timer. So all of this here happens right at the beginning as the user logs in. And so actually this part in the beginning here, everything that is inside the update UI will be the first thing that we will do. Okay, then from there we will implement the kind of fake login, and then we will take care of these other operations. So probably we will come back to this flowchart by then. But anyway, this is already a very good overview of all the steps that we have to implement in order to build this application. And you can spend some more time on this and actually compare it to the functionality of the application. That's why, one more time, I included this flowchart in the starter files of this section. Now this time, just like in the pig game, I built this flowchart myself because all that matters here in this project is to build this application and learn all about arrays. But in the next big project, we will actually plan the entire application together, and I will show you all the steps that we have to go through in order to come up with a flowchart like this. So don't worry about designing a flowchart just yet. We will learn how it works and how to plan an application from the ground up. But for now, again, my purpose with this flowchart is just to give us a good overview, so a good roadmap to actually go ahead and implement all the features of this application. And so then, whenever we get lost, we can always just come back to this flowchart and see exactly how the application works and what we have left to implement. Okay, but with that being said, let's now go back to our code editor and take a closer look at all the starter files that we have there. So right at the top of our script, we have these 4 account objects. Okay, and so this one here was the JS that I just showed you in the demo. And so here then are the movements stored in that object. We also have the pin, and later on we will also use this interest rate. Okay, now of course in the real world you would want much more data about each of the movements, not just the value, right? For example, we would use the date of each movement, maybe a description, and so on. But here we really just want to work with arrays. And so I'm keeping it very simple, but still at the same time fun to build. Okay? So yeah, so one object for each account. And you could ask, why not use a map instead of an object? Well, the thing is that we're going to pretend that all this data is coming from a web API. So a little bit like we talked about earlier. And whenever we get data from an API, this data usually comes in the form of objects. And so this is why we have objects here. And then finally, an array containing all these account objects in there. Remember that this is one of the most common ways of organizing data in JavaScript applications. And so that's why we are going to use it throughout this section to make this actually feel a bit more like a real-world application. All right. So that's the data. Let's take a look here a little bit at the other files. So as always, we have the prettier configuration. Then here's the flowchart that I just showed you. And so here you can take a look at it by yourself. Then the index.html, and this one is a lot more complex now, and we will actually need it to take some code out of there. Then here we have the icon and the logo. So like this icon you see here in the tab, so the fav icon. And finally we have the style. And so here you can have some fun and learn some CSS if you're interested in it. So it's almost like 300 lines of code, I think, that I built to style this application. So you see, I really put a lot of work to make this application really fun. Okay. So I think that's it for the starter files. Just notice that I already selected all of the elements that we're going to need. So you see, it's a lot of stuff, and I'm going to explain what each of this is. But what matters is that this way, we don't have to write all of this code ourselves. And so this makes development a little bit faster. So a lot of elements here. And yeah, so I think that's it for this video. I think you got a good overview of this project for this section. And once again, please go ahead and take a look at this URL by yourself and use user.js and pin 1111. And then when you're familiar with how the application works, then let's move on. In this video, we're finally going to be back to DOM manipulation. And we're going to learn a couple of DOM manipulation techniques And we will use them together with the forEach method that we just learned about. So this is really exciting stuff. So let's get started. And to start, let's actually open up the HTML and CSS files. And we will then keep them open here throughout this project. And I like to have the script always the last. Now in the HTML, we have this navigation bar. So this nav element, which is all of this top part. And then after that, we have the main element. And so that's basically the entire application. And that part is right now invisible. And so that's because here in the CSS, so in line 87, we have the app selector and the opacity is set to 0. And so we need to comment that. And for that, we can, as always, use command / give it a save, and then we can finally see the application here. All right. So logging in and out of this application is essentially just changing this opacity here. And so now the opacity is basically back to 100 because now we commented it out. And so 100 is the default. But anyway, let's go back to our script here. And so what we want to do now is to basically display these movements right here in the application, here in this list. So in this container. So for each movement, we want one element like this. Okay? And we will be able to do that because of the forEach method, which will allow us to loop through this array and then in each iteration basically create an element like this and display it on the page. So this time we're finally gonna move away from the console and actually do some DOM manipulation here. All right, so let's move down here after these elements, but still inside of the app part of this file, and then let's write our code. Now we could simply start writing our code out here in the global context. However, that is not a good practice. So whenever we do something like this, it's always best to create a function. So let's call this one print or a display. I prefer display. So display movements, and then we make this function receive the data with which it should actually work. So in this case, that's the movements. So we call this parameter movements because this function should receive one array of movements and then work with that data. So in this case, that's the movements that it should display in the user interface. All right? And so it's a good practice to pass the data into a function instead of, for example, having this function work with a global variable. That would work as well, but it's a lot better to pass that data directly into the function. Okay, so get used to that kind of approach. All right. So again, instead of working with global variables, start passing the data that a function needs actually into that function. So let me, as always, call this function first to see what we will get as an input. And so the movements that I will use here will come from this account1. So essentially, that's going to be this array. So account1.movements. So account1.movements. Okay, and so inside of this function, these movements are simply called movements. And so now let's loop over these movements using what we learned before. So forEach and then our callback function here. Now inside of this function, we need the current movement and we also need the index. And that's because here actually I have them here number 1, number 2, and so basically we have the movements numbered like this. Okay, so starting with the first movement down and then adding the new ones on top. Okay, all right, so that's the easiest part. Now we have to essentially create an HTML that looks like this. So let's go to our HTML file and to actually take a look at what this HTML looks like. So we are inside our app element here basically. Then we have this movements element, which is all of this container here. And maybe it would be easier to actually see this in the console. So if we did this, maybe we can get rid of this part. Not really. But anyway, now we can see that all of this is the movements. And then in each movement, we have a movements row. So each of this is a movements row. Okay. And so let's now copy the entire code of one movements row, because this is what we want to create in each iteration of the loop with the current data. So essentially, let's take all of this. So I'm going to copy it, and let me now paste it here into a template string. So I will create a variable which I'm going to call HTML, and then I'm creating a template literal. And template literals are amazing for creating HTML templates like the one we will create now. Because now it's really easy to create a multi-line string like this. Okay, let's just fix indentation here a little bit to make this then easier to understand. Okay, and now all we have to do is to basically replace the data that's not relevant, so this hard-coded data, with our actual movements data. Okay, now this part here of the date we will not do now. We will take care of this in the next section. So let's get rid of it. And then here we have the movements value. So this is formatted, but again, we will just use the plain value that's coming out of the array for now. And so now we can simply insert that here. And so that's mov, right? So mov is the current element in the array that we are looping over. And so in each iteration, that will then be one of the movements in the array. Then here we have toDeposit. And so we will have to check whether a certain movement is a deposit or a withdrawal. So let's delete that. And for now, we can add the number here. So you see 1, 2, and so for that, we now use the I. And so that's why we also needed the current index besides just the current value. Okay, and now we need a way to knowing if it's a deposit or a withdrawal. And so let's use a ternary operator, and let's do that out here as a separate variable, because we will need that twice. We will need it one to write it here on the user interface, but here also this class name depends on that. So you see that we have type deposit, so that's then this green color, and we have type withdrawal, and so that's then this red color. So we will need this information twice, and so let's just calculate it outside here. So I'm going to call it type, and so this is the same logic as before. So if the current movement is greater than 0, then the type should be deposit, or else it should then be withdrawal. Okay, and now let's write that here. So the type here, and again also here in the class name. So we can also basically construct this class name here, which is very useful too. And I hope here you can see that the template literal is really a lifesaver here. Okay, so we created our HTML template here. Now all we need to do is to find a way to actually adding this HTML onto the web page here. So we need to attach this HTML somehow into this container, so into this movements element. Okay, and to do that, we will use a method called insert adjacent HTML. So that's got to go right here. So let me first write the name of the method, And then I'm going to tell you where we actually have to attach this method to. So it's called insert adjacent HTML. And we are going to call this method on this movements element here. So this container onto which we want to add a new movements row element. So this element here on which we want to add a new movements row, right? So we are looking for an element with the class of movements, and as I told you in the last lecture, I already selected all of these elements. And so in this case, it's this one, and so the name is container movements. Okay, so you see that I used kind of uniform names here. So I have container app for this entire application container and container movements. Then all the other ones are called label, so label welcome, date, and so on and so forth. Then the others are called button, and then all the input fields are all called input, and then whatever the name of them. So to keep it nice and easy to understand. But anyway, this one is called container movements. And so onto there, again, we call insert adjacent HTML. And this method accepts two strings. The first string is the position in which we want to attach the HTML. And this one I'm going to set to after begin, but there are more options. And I think the best way of showing it to you is actually in the documentation. So MDN, and so whenever I need to figure out something, this is how I do it. So I know that down here there is a visualization, and yeah. So these are the four options here, and the one we chose is after begin. So that's this one. So imagine that this P element here is our container movements, and so basically I want to add new elements right after the beginning of this element. And so basically I'm saying here that I want to insert the new child element right after the beginning of the parent element. So again, that's container movements. Then we have before end, which is at the end of the element, as the name says. And then we can even put it outside of the parent element. And then we could even put it outside of the container movements. And sometimes this is useful as well. But usually I always use after begin or before end. And once we see the result, I will explain a bit better why it is after begin and not before end. But anyway, let's go back here, because now we need to specify the second argument, and that is the string containing the HTML that we want to insert. And that's it. So if we now run this, it should already work. And yes, it does. So that's amazing. And let's check it out, and let's compare it with our values. And so indeed, the newest one is the last one here. And so that's element number 8. And it is indeed 1300, right? And it is indeed green because it is a deposit, so a positive number. The same with the 70, and then we have minus 130. And so indeed, that's a withdrawal. Beautiful. Now, if we scroll down here, we will see that we still have these two old ones. So basically the two that were already there. And that's because all we are doing is to add new elements to this container. Right? We are only inserting new HTML here inside of the container movements, but we are not overriding anything. And so actually that has to be the first thing that we do. So the first thing is to essentially empty the entire container, and only then we start adding new elements. So that's something common to do, and it is also not difficult at all. So container movements, and now we can use the inner HTML property, inner HTML, and set it to the empty string. And that's it. So this fixes our problem. All right. Now inner HTML here is a little bit similar to text content. So remember that. Now the difference is that text content simply returns the text itself, while HTML returns everything, including the HTML. So all the HTML tags will be included. Okay? But here we are then using inner HTML as a setter. So just like we also used text content equal empty string or equal something else. Remember? So we used to do in our pick game, for example, like whatever and then text content and then set it to 0. Remember that? But as I said, we can also use this to read data. So let's simply log to the console just to understand this property, which is pretty important. So after all this, let's do container movements.inner HTML. So we're simply reading the inner HTML and then logging it to the console. So console, and indeed, here you see all of this HTML. All right. So essentially, that's the HTML that we just created. Okay. But let's get rid of this. I just wanted to show you both sides or both applications of inner HTML. All right. And finally, I wanted to show you why I used after begin and not before end. Well, let me show you what would happen with before end. I think this is how it works. So before end. Yeah. So with that, the order of the movements would be inverted. Okay. And that's because each new element would simply be added after the previous one. So at the end of the container, right? And so that's after all the child elements that are already in there. And that's why I wanted it to be the other way around. Because like this, it will always be basically appended to all the other children. So any new child element will appear before all the other child elements that were already there. And so now we are back to the order that we wanted here. All right, that's amazing. So we completed the first part of our user interface here already, and all with the power of the forEach method. And then also we introduced some new concepts, in particular here the insert adjacent HTML method and then the inner HTML property. Now there are many other ways of creating elements in JavaScript besides this one here, and we're going to study all of them in great detail in a future section. But this here is actually the one that I like the most. It's the easy, quick and dirty solution, so to say. So all we have to do is to create a string of HTML, and then we can insert that simply with this method. So very simple, very straightforward. So this is some great DOM manipulation that we did right here, and I'm really happy about the result that we got here in our application. Great, so let's now move on. Welcome back to the first coding challenge of the arrays section. And in this one, Julia and Kate are doing a study on dogs. So each of them asked 5 dog owners about their dog's age, and then they stored that data into an array. And that's one array for each of them. All right? And in this study, they are interested in knowing whether each of the dogs is an adult or a puppy. And the rule is that a dog is an adult if it is at least 3 years old, and it's a puppy if it's less than 3 years old. And by the way, the test data here, so the arrays for each is down here, so test data 1 and 2. All right? So your task is to create a function called checkDogs, which accepts these 2 arrays and does the following things. So first, Julia found out that the owners of the first and the last 2 dogs do actually have cats and not dogs. So here, what I want you to do is to create a shallow copy of Julia's array and then remove the cat ages from the copied array. And you should copy it because it's a bad practice to mutate the parameters or the arguments of a function. Then, second, create an array with both Julia's and Kate's data. So for Julia, of course, the corrected data. And then for each of the dogs, simply log to the console whether it is an adult with a string like this or a puppy and then with a string like this. And that's, of course, according to the rules in the beginning. And then just run this function for both test data sets. And that's it. So all you need to do is to use the tools from all the lectures in this section so far, and then I think you will be fine solving this on your own. So this is really all about using the tools that we already learned before, and there's not a lot of new thinking to do here. So I hope you managed to do this one, and I see you back here in a second. All right. So hopefully you did this just fine without any problems. But I will anyway write my solution here and explain what I'm doing. So we accept the dogs from Julia and the dogs from Kate. And we will call this with the test data. And so Julia's data is this. And there's not a need to store them in separate variables. I will just call the function like this. All right. And now we should create a shallow copy of docs Julia so that we can then remove some elements from there. So docs Julia corrected dot slice. And so I'm using here the method and not the spread operator. And now I will simply remove some elements from there. So docs Julia corrected dot splice. And so it tells us that the first and the last two dogs are not valid, basically. So the first is element number 0, and then we want to remove 1. So that's the first part. And then docs Julia corrected dot splice, and then the last 2, which is -2. Okay? So let's take a look here simply at docs Julia corrected, just to see if this is correct, actually. So we need the console now. And so this was our beginning data. And indeed, the first and the last 2 are gone here. All right. Now, of course, you could have also done this in a different way, which is to simply copy the correct data from the original using the slice method. So something like this. Docs Julia dot slice. So starting from the second one and then all the way to the third one. Okay, and so this would give us the exact same result, but in this case, I just wanted to use the splice method. And in fact, I wanted you to use the splice method as well, and that's why I gave you that task like that. Anyway, we don't need this here anymore. Let's now simply create a new variable with both these dogs. So simply calling it dogs. And again, we could use the spread operator here, which I actually prefer. But since we are in the arrays section here, let's do everything with array methods. So that's the concat method, remember. And then we want to join the corrected Julia docs with docs Kate. So always a good idea to check. And yeah, that's correct. All right. And so all we have to do now is basically create this string. Let me just copy this string. And so looping over this array is now an easy task, hopefully. So dogs.forEach, then the callback function, And one more time, we need actually the current element and also the index. And that's because here is the number, so dog number 1, and it's going to go all the way to 7. And so let's check out our rule. So a dog is an adult if he is at least 3 years old. So if dog is greater equal 3, then log a string like this. So here is the index plus 1. Here goes the dog itself, and then else is still a puppy. And here we need just this. And I think with this we are good. Let's just remove this. And yes, dog number 1 is 5 years old, so it's still an adult. Number 2 is 2 years old, so still a puppy. This is again a puppy with 1 year old. And so, yeah, that's the correct solution. Now let's just do it for this test data here. Then I'm gonna duplicate this one. Let's just comment out the first one. And okay, here we only have one puppy, which is the one before the last. And so this one is correct as well. And so, challenge completed. In JavaScript, there are 3 big and important array methods that we use all the time to perform data transformations. So basically, these are methods that we use to create new arrays based on transforming data from other arrays. And in recent years, these tools have become really popular, and for good reasons, and therefore you will see them everywhere you look in modern JavaScript. And the tools I'm talking about are map, filter, and reduce. So these are 3 array methods, and in this lecture I'm going to give you a quick overview of them. Then, over the next couple of lectures, we're going to dive deep into these 3 methods in practice so that we can use them throughout the rest of the course. First, the map method is yet another method that we can use to loop over arrays. So map is actually similar to the forEach method that we studied before, but with the difference that map creates a brand new array based on the original array. So essentially, the map method takes an array, loops over that array, and in each iteration, it applies a callback function that we specify in our code to the current array element. So in this example, we say that each element should be multiplied by 2. And with this callback in place, the map method multiplies every single element by 2 and puts it into a new array. We say that it maps the values of the original array to a new array. And that's why this method is called map. And it is extremely useful, usually way more useful than the forEach method, because forEach simply allows us to do some work with each array element. But map, on the other hand, builds us a brand new array containing the results of applying an operation to the original array. Alright, and we will use the map method in practice right in the next video. Anyway, next up we have the filter method, which, as the name says, is used to filter for elements in the original array which satisfy a certain condition. So in this example, we're only looking for elements greater than 2. So only elements that pass the test that we specified will make it into a new filtered array. Or in other words, elements for which the condition is true will be included in a new array that the filter method returns. all other elements will get filtered out, so they will not be included in the new array. And finally, there is also the reduce method, which we use to boil down all the elements of the original array into one single value. And an example of this can be to add all the elements of an array together, but we can also do many other interesting things. So for the example of adding up all numbers in the array, we need to specify an operation like this one, where we have an accumulator variable. Then, as the reduce method loops over the array, it keeps adding the current element onto the accumulator until, at the end of the loop, we have the total sum of all the elements. So you can imagine this as a snowball that keeps getting bigger and bigger as it rolls down a hill. And so this is known as the snowball effect, and reduce is pretty similar to that. Okay, so keep that in mind as a nice analogy. Now we also say that this whole process has now reduced the original array to one single value, which in this case is the sum of all the elements, but it can of course be many other operations. Now it's this value that then actually gets returned from the reduce method in the end. So there is no new array in this case, but only the reduced value. Now this probably sounds more complicated than it actually is, and so let's start to put it into practice right in the next video. Let's now start seeing the three data transformation methods in practice, starting with the map method in this video. And as we just learned, the map method is yet another way that we can use to loop over arrays. But unlike forEach, the map method will give us a brand new array. And this new array will contain in each position the result of applying a callback function to the original array elements. So let's see how that works. And let's start by bringing back our movements array here. So this one, so we will once more work with these movements, and in this one we will try to convert them to US dollars. So let's suppose these movements are in euros and we now want to convert them to US dollars. And let's suppose that 1 euro is worth $1.1. So let's just store that conversion rate here first to a separate variable. So euro to USD is 1.1. And so now what we want to do is to basically multiply each element of the movements array by this 1.1. So let's say movements.map, and then just like in the forEach method, we need a callback function. And this callback function also gets as an argument the current array element. So again, just like in the forEach method that we studied before. And that's why I said back then that once you understood the forEach method, all the other methods will then become a lot easier to understand. So let's call this one here mov one more time. And then here in the callback function, we need to return the value that we want the new array to have in the current position. And so in this case, we want the original array times the euro to USD conversion rate. And this will make sense when we now see this result. And so let's actually store it to a variable. So we already know that the map method will return a brand new array. And so we need to store that somewhere. So let's call it movements USD. And then let's log both to the console movements and movements USD. Give it a save, and sometimes we need to reload the page as well. But anyway, here is the result. Now, never mind these multiplication errors here. I will explain you a little bit later where they come from. But essentially, this new value here is now 220, which is exactly 200 times 1.1. And so indeed, we ended up with a new array containing all the movements but converted from euros to US dollars. And again, that's because that is exactly what we returned here from this callback function. We could, of course, have returned simply something else. So we could have returned simply 23. And so what do you think we will end up in this situation? Well, we now simply have an array of the same length, which in each of the position contains 23, because that's what we returned from the callback function. And so in each iteration of the original movements array, it simply put 23 into the new array at the same position. But of course, that's a little bit useless, and so let's go back to the example that we're working with. Great. And of course, you can also see that the original movements array was not mutated at all, right? And so indeed, the map method really only returns a new array with the new elements. And this really is the fundamentals of how the map method works. So we can use this, and we will use it in all kinds of different situations. Now, just for fun, let's write the same thing here using a for-off loop. So we can create another mov, and then we are looping the movements, of course. And so in this loop, we want to create a new array. And so in this case, actually, we first need to create that new array. So let's call it again movements USD, but then for. So here we first need to define that empty array, and then as we loop over movements, we keep pushing a value to the new movements USD for array. So push and the current element times euros to USD. Let's log that as well, and it should look exactly the same. And in fact, it does. And so, yeah, we could have written this here, and it doesn't look too bad either, but it's a completely different philosophy. So here, in the map method, we use a function to solve this problem of creating a new array. While here, we simply loop over one array and then manually create a new one. So these are completely different philosophies, or we can also say paradigms. So this here is more in line with functional programming, which is something that I have mentioned a couple of times in this course, and we will talk about it later in greater detail. And in modern JavaScript, there's definitely a push going on in the direction of functional programming, so of a more functional language, and therefore in modern JavaScript, this here is the way to go. So using methods together with callback functions like this is the new and modern way of doing stuff. All right, but now let's actually make our callback function here look a little bit cleaner. So this callback function, we can simplify it greatly. So do you remember arrow functions? We could perfectly use an arrow function here and simplify this here into just one line of code. So here is my challenge for you. Do you think that you can do that yourself? So basically replacing this callback with an arrow function. Take a minute and see if you can do that for yourself, and I'll see you back here in a second. So let's just copy this and then replace this by parts. So first we can remove the function keyword and then replace it with an arrow. Then we can also remove these parentheses here because there's only one argument. And finally, since we only have one line of code, we can remove the curly braces, and we can even remove the return statement. And so this code that we have here now is exactly the same as before. So we can comment out this one here. And of course, I'm leaving it here for reference. But as I save it now, you see that the result is exactly the same. And so here we now have a nice and clean one-liner callback function, just like this. However, many people don't like the way that this looks. So they argue that this lacks the function and the return keyword, which they say leads to bad readability and that it makes this whole thing more difficult to understand. And while I can see that that might be true, I actually do prefer the fact how much smaller and cleaner this code is. So in my opinion, if you understand well enough how the arrow function actually works, then you will become familiar with this pretty quickly. And so then there is no problem in writing code like this. Okay? The main thing that you need to keep in mind is that here we are actually returning this value. So you need to remember that this is like writing return here. And so if you understand that, then you're good to go. So I will actually use arrow functions in these situations in the rest of the course, because I believe that they are perfect for these small callback functions. In my opinion, they were really developed for this kind of application. But as always, if you do prefer the regular function syntax, then please feel 100% free to keep using them instead. And with that being said, let's now experiment a little bit more and explore the map method some more. So, just like the forEach method, the map method also has access to the exact same three parameters. So besides the current array element, which is this one here, we also get access to the current index as well as the whole array. So let's now use the map method to loop again over the movements array, but this time we're going to create a string similar to the ones that we printed to the console earlier using forEach. So let me actually get that logic. And so it's this one here. So let's specify a callback function. And indeed, now I will actually use an arrow function. And so, as I said, we get access to the current element, but also to the index and to the entire array. This time we do need a block, at least for now, and then here we have our logic. Now in this case, we will not log something to the console. So instead, we want to return the string so that it then gets put into the new array that results from the map method. So let's say here, movements descriptions. So that's a long name. But anyway, again, here we do not want to log something to the console. So we don't want to simply do something with this value like we do when we console.log. Instead, we really want to return it. And so that will then place this value into the new array. So let's save that. Let's then also log this to the console, movement descriptions. And so indeed, we get this array with these strings that we previously logged to the console. And by the way, it's completely acceptable to have two return statements or even more in the same function, as long as only one of them is executed, right? So in this case, either this one here is executed or this one. It's impossible for both of them to return at the same time, right? And actually we can even simplify this whole thing here, because these two strings are essentially the exact same thing except for this word here. And so let's do something else here, right? Now you also have this math.absolute value, but if the value is already positive as it is here, then that simply makes no difference. And so let's use a ternary operator here to put either withdrew or deposited right here. And so this has nothing to do with the map method, but yeah, it's a good way to also keep practicing the other skills that we have been learning. So we can check if the movement is greater than 0, so the same condition as here, and if it is, then at this part of the string, it should say deposited. And if not, well, then it should say withdrew. And so like this, we built this string all in one go. And so we can get rid of this, we can get rid of this, and so therefore we don't need the return keyword anymore. And so it works just the same. Okay? Now in this case, we don't need this array here, so let's actually also get rid of it. And it's a good idea to keep in mind why we actually get access to these two parameters here. So one more time, all we do here is to pass this callback function into the map method, right? But we do not call this function by ourselves. It is the map method who will call this function for each of the array elements in the movement array. Okay? Now, each time that the map method calls or callback, it will simply pass in the current array element as well as the current index and the whole array. And of these three, here we are only using the first two, just the current element and the current index. Alright, and with this, I hope that by now it is really crystal clear how this all works. Now you could say that what we did here with this map method is essentially the same as what we did with the forEach method. But in fact, there is a big difference between these two approaches. So before, we printed each line individually to the console as we were looping over the array. So in each of the iterations, we performed some action that was then visible in the console. And we can call this a side effect. So the forEach method creates side effects. But now, here with this map method, all we did was to return each of the strings from the callback. And so basically they got added into a new array. And then finally, we logged that entire array to the console and not the elements one by one. And so here, in this map method, we did not create a side effect in each of the iteration. All we did was to build a brand new array. And this idea of side effects will become important again as we talk more about functional programming. Great! And this is how the map method works. In the next video, we will see a more practical application of it in the context of our Bankist application.